Thank you, Bhaskar. Thanks for that generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to be at IDSA, where I spent 10 long years as a full-time employee, and many others pretending to do research in the IDSA library, and been associated, say, at least for the last 30 years and more. So it's a delight to be here. Uh, as I said, Bhaskar said, I'm an interloper into this session, but hopefully what I say about India's new imperatives in the region would take us smoothly to the next session, where the session is focused on India. What I wanted to make, what I say is not official policy or even reflect official policy. So what I'm going to say is my understanding of where India's approach, where does it come from, and where is it likely to go in the coming years, framing it in terms of geopolitics and the oil question that this session actually talks about. So essentially, I have 5 points to make. The first point I wanted to make was when we talk about geopolitics, of course, what we're talking about, how geography connects different regions. And I think here, India's relationship with the Middle East as a whole, and with the Gulf in particular, is a profound one, is a deep one. And the fact that we are next to each other has connected us historically in terms of flows of people, goods, ideas, and you name it, everything that has linked these two regions in a historic sense, and much of it comes from the fact that we are proximate to each other. But I think this interdependence between the two regions, you see it in the Mughal culture here, or the fact that Persian was India's official language until 1850 or so. You have the impact of Arabic, Turkish on Indian languages. So I think, but this interdependence acquired a new level of intensity under the British Raj. The fact that the Gulf, especially, and the Middle East were en route to India, where the European colonial powers were coming into the Indian Ocean, securing those sea lanes that moved commerce and resources on both ways, and to prevent other European powers from threatening the British primacy in the subcontinent, there was a profound security structure that was created where India became the principal security provider. I mean, there's a current term, but actually, if you look at India's relationship with the Gulf, much of the Gulf was India's protectorate in a sense that the Raj had taken responsibility to secure the region, not because of any charity but because India's own interests were fundamentally involved, and that preventing what was called the Great Game, preventing the other great powers from coming into Europe, was critical for securing the glosses that British were trying to build in India. And I think that problem, that brings me to the second point. This problem got complicated with the partition of the subcontinent. What was a clear relationship that existed where the subcontinent became the source of security for the undivided subcontinent, and its resources that went into securing the Gulf and the Middle East. You can look at the Second World War and the First World War. In both the wars, the Indian Army has a very, very important role in both the wars. And throughout the 19th century, that India, British India, and British India's, undivided India's expansive resources played a key role. But the moment you partition the subcontinent, then the dynamic of play between the subcontinent, between India and the Gulf and the Middle East changed fundamentally, because India lost its border, the creation of Pakistan, and the India's problem of dealing with the Gulf, which was largely an Islamic region, and to cope with the efforts of Pakistan, which was claiming to represent the Muslims, which was supposed to be land of all Muslims, the pure land of the pure, and also taking its disputes with India into the Gulf region or into the Middle East, of trying to mobilize the Middle East as a counter to India. And of course, India had its own way of dealing with it, emphasizing its secularism, emphasizing Arab solidarity, emphasizing G77 and NAM, etc. That India tried to counter it, but the problem of dealing with a sibling who was claiming its existence on the basis of religion in a region that was predominantly Muslim, how does India deal with it? And I think the problem has been a central one, and I think India had to deal with it. And I think a lot of India's energies continue to go into dealing with that problem. I mean, I think no official is going to talk about it, but I think any analyst, there's no way of missing this dimension of India's engagement with the region. That brings me to the third aspect, which is that the partition of the subcontinent also had a link to the energy issue. Those of you might have had a chance to stumble upon a man called Olaf Caro's book called The Wells of Power. The wells of power were represented as oil was discovered in the Gulf at the turn of the 20th century. The protection of the oil resources, that is the wells of power, was a principal element that went into making the importance of Pakistan after partition, of securing the Gulf, and in fact, the unreliability, shall we say, of the Congress Party or the Indian National Congress to be a partner in the future post-war imperial defense system meant that the reliance of the Anglo-American powers on Pakistan and Pakistan's military became a central theme. So I think that problem of how does India deal with the question of wells of power and Pakistan's role that came with it has remained with us, and I think that problem too has not disappeared. But it also created problems of a different level, where the creation of CENTO, where Pakistan became part of the Cold War alliance structures in the Middle East. So in a sense, the dynamic of securing the wells of power, or the southern flank of the Soviet Union then, fed into the way the South Asian politics played, and where India had to deal with the fact Pakistan was in military alliance with the Western powers, and coping with that became a problem. And I think that issue, in terms of, if you look at the Indian rhetoric of much of it presented in anti-imperialist terms, of course it had actually a problem that the American power aligned with Pakistan was a security threat. I mean, to reduce it to bare bones, and dealing with that had been a challenge for India, and I think how it deals with it has remained with us. That brings me to the fourth point, which is about oil again. That India's initial approach to oil politics was to do the minimal. I mean, that India's economy was closed. It required oil from the region, largely buying oil on a spot markets, rather than imagining the relationship in a fundamental terms. And that changed only somewhere around 2000, where India began to talk about its relationship with the Gulf, especially in terms of energy security, as opposed to mere buying of oil from the Gulf kingdoms. And I think that integration, where India's economic reforms post-1991 created conditions where rapid economic growth increased the demand for energy, and therefore the Gulf, especially the Gulf, became a central part of India's energy calculus, and therefore the relationship on the energy dimension became a deep one. And more fundamentally, the boom in the Gulf economies, once the oil boom came in 1973, also meant the Indian labor would be exported to the Gulf. That is, it was not just India was buying oil, but India was building the Gulf. Indian labor, or the South Asian the divided South Asia's labor was instrumental in creating what the modern Gulf is, when you look at all those beautiful buildings. But the labor that went in, so the labor export became a critical element, and that further tightened the interdependence between the two regions. And then as India became a major exporter, that Gulf region has become the third largest source destination for India's markets, India's exports. And so therefore, I think what you saw was then the interdependence between the two regions has dramatically grown since the 1990s. Now, the challenge is going to be in the coming years, if what Girjesh was saying is going to be right, if oil is going to be priced at $20, and if the economy comes down, the challenge for India would be, how do I deal with a region where the oil is not going to be central, or the oil revenues are going to be significantly down? Will it force movement of labor back to India? Will it create turbulence? And a whole range of issues on which this interdependence, managing this interdependence, is going to be fundamentally different from what we had to deal with in the past, which was, how do I secure my oil? But today, if oil is plentiful, and because it's priced low, it creates turbulence within the region. Dealing with that is going to be an extraordinary challenge, and I think we barely begin to put our heads to it. That brings me to the last question, which is the original question that we began with. I mean, can India return to a more pragmatic role? That is, the way India argued its case here, or way India perceived and talked to itself about the region, has changed because India's own weight in the international system has improved. And I think the biggest challenge is going to be, how does India respond to the demand for security in the Gulf? Is it going to merely pretend, like in the non-aligned age, that we have nothing to do with it, we're neutral? Or is it going to say, look, I must engage the region and the concerns of security in the region? Because if you go back, I mean, I think when British left east of Suez, Oman got independence, the first thing Oman came to India to look at a security treaty with India. So the many Gulf kingdoms have had no problem seeing India as a security partner. But it was India that was unwilling to take on that role in the past. And now the question is going to be, is India prepared to do more on the security domain? Both in terms of counterterrorism and the range of related issues, as well as military cooperation, specific military security cooperation. Is that possible? There, of course, the governments, when these come to these areas, are always going to be touchy about it. But if you look at even the last 10 years, there have been slow, incremental expansion of India's security partnerships in the region. But my sense is, if the scale of the challenges in the Gulf and the Middle East, which is whatever the problems the Middle East has had, it has had a stable political structure for 100 years from post-Sykes-Picot. But if that stable structure is going to unravel in front of our eyes, India cannot pretend to be non-aligned. India cannot pretend to be separate from this. India cannot pretend that we have nothing to do here. Nor can it rely on the Americans to take care of it, because if the Americans move to an offshore balance and the Chinese play a larger role, boy, this is going to be a different Middle East, one in which India will have to rethink many of its fundamental premises. And to get there would be to start with some measure of pragmatism and dealing with the region as it is, not what we want it to be or what we pretend it is. And I think it is that mental transition that's going to be the biggest challenge. Thank you, sir.